They say you can't win your league in the first round of fantasy football drafts, but you can lose it. That's what we're talking about today. Players who have league losing downside in your fantasy football drafts this year. Now, we're not just talking about first round guys. We're talking about guys within the top 5 rounds, and specifically 5 players, within the first 3 rounds. So Ty, I'm going to have you start us here. Who is your first player that you want to talk about with a league losing downside?
It's Derrick Henry, the old, trusted and true asset that used to be in fantasy football, right? We are changing teams at 30 years old with over 2,000 carries, but only 155 receptions. And one of my favorite shows is the NBA on TNT crew, EJ's Neato Stat of the Night. One of my favorite bits. That's nearly a 13-to-1 ratio. Okay, that is a massive ratio of carries to receptions. And last year we saw 280 carries for just under 1,200 rushing yards, 12 touchdowns. He also added 28 receptions for just over 200 yards. That put him as the running back 16 in points per game. And the question that you need to ask yourself is, can it really get better than that in Baltimore? And allow me to define better for you. In 2019, he had 300 carries for 1,540 yards. Let me try that again. 1,540 yards. That sounds a lot better. And 16 touchdowns. In 2020, he had 378 carries for 2,027 yards and 17 touchdowns. And in 2022, he had 349 carries for 1,538 yards and 13 touchdowns. Can it really get better than, again, from what we saw last year? Can he get 300 carries? Can he hit 1,500 yards? Can he get at least 13 touchdowns? He needs all of those, not just one of those things. He needs all of those things. Add in that this offensive line in Baltimore is not the same one that we saw last year. It is very, very questionable, right? Ronnie Stanley, the all-pro left tackle, he has never played a full 16 or 17 game season. Your offensive guards of Andrew Voorhees, whose first NFL action was this preseason since tearing his ACL during the 2023 Combine, and Daniel Falele, who got kicked inside to guard because he couldn't stay at tackle. Okay, those are your guards, and you've got your all-pro center in Tyler Linderbaum. You've got bright spots in Linderbaum and Stanley when they're healthy. But you've also got pretty big question marks on this offensive line. And to me, there's just not enough high-value touches for him in this Baltimore offense to make him a sure thing that he was in Tennessee.
Yeah, once upon a time, this was a dream move for Derrick Henry to go to the Baltimore Ravens, right? You would have loved this if you weren't in the Melvin Gordon, Lev Bell, and who else was rotating in there? It was Gus Edwards, the other back, who was rotating in there that one year, where it was basically a 3-headed monster, and everyone was just disgusted by this running back room. It's like, please, anybody but those guys. Yeah, this offensive line for the Ravens is concerning. It is not the same unit as in years past, and you named it as well. Derrick Henry is 30 years old, going to a new team. I'm just drafting a 30-year-old running back as a top 10 back in fantasy football. That's just a bet I'm not going to take whatsoever. I'm going to bet against that 9 times out of 10, and the ninth and the one time is going to be when Christian McCaffrey turns 30 and he's still dominating fantasy football. So I couldn't agree with you more here. I think the one thing I will ask about Derrick Henry, how many touchdowns do you think he needs to actually return on this value? I know you said like he needs all of them, but like we are talking about him as the running back 9 in drafts right now, the latter half of the second round. How many touchdowns does Derrick Henry actually need to return on the running back 9 this year?
I would say that we need to get close to 15, just because last year we saw Raheem Mostert put up 18 rushing touchdowns to be the running back 1. Gus Edwards was tied for the running back 3 in touchdowns last year at 13, but he only averaged 11 fantasy points a game. So yes, like that, the best way for Derrick Henry to return value is on touchdowns. And I think a lot of people, again, they will say, well, Gus Edwards could score 13 last year, so Derrick Henry can definitely get that. Yeah, I think so too. But at the same time, like by saying that, we are doing a 1-for-1. this is not going to be the same Baltimore team that we saw last year just because of offensive line play. Now, like Baltimore usually figures these things out. Like that's Baltimore's MO, that they get these no-name offensive linemen that come in and become mainstays. That being said, though, there is just so much that I am not comfortable with when it comes to Derrick Henry, because we do need to hit a threshold of, I would say, 15 touchdowns. If he's just not going to get receiving work on top of it, like I also want to say too, like Jim Harbaugh has already come out and said that Justice Hill is going to be a piece in this offense too.
Yes.
Which you may not think that like Justice Hill is worthy enough of like taking touches away from Derrick Henry, but we said the same thing last year with Devin Singletary and Dameon Pierce. Different situation. But if the coaches think that the next running back in line is good enough to get on the field, they're going to get them on the field.
Yeah, that was going to be the final point I wrapped up here with, is by the time you also factor in, 130, 40, 50 carries for Lamar Jackson, been some positive coach speak buzz around Justice Hill, as you mentioned. I mean, it's just not realistic for a 30-year-old running back to be given 290 carries in a season. I just don't see that happening. And boil in the poor offensive line, boil in, he's got to hit at least 12, 13 touchdowns as a return on value. I just think there's a far more likely scenario that he blows up your fantasy team by spending a late second round pick on him than he returns on value and you're actually extremely satisfied with your second round investment in Derrick Henry. I'm going to get a little bit bold time. I'm going to go further up the board than Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry is the second highest player drafted that we're going to talk about here. I'm going almost a full round ahead. That is not true. Wow, Derrick Henry is going middle of the second round right now?
Yeah.
I thought he was going tail into the second round. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, in that case, I'm only going a few picks ahead of Derrick Henry, I guess, because I'm going to talk about Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts. I am a Shane Steichen believer. I am pro Shane Steichen. He is a great football mind. I think he can make this offense work really, really well in the NFL this year, but I am skeptical to invest first round draft capital into a guy who's basically sharing his bread and butter with an alpha rushing quarterback. Josh Norris of the Underdog Football Show, he brought up a phenomenal stat from Jonathan Taylor's overall running back one campaign a few years back. In that season, Jonathan Taylor had 85 red zone rush attempts, while the next closest player had 46. That is a 40 carry difference. Jonathan Taylor also had 26 rush attempts inside of the 5. The next closest player had 16. And all offseason, we have been drafting Jahmyr Gibbs ahead of Jonathan Taylor. But now Taylor has leapfrogged him, and all because of a preseason hamstring injury that all reports have said that Jahmyr Gibbs should be good to go by week 1. And at worst, Jahmyr Gibbs isn't 100% healthy until week 2, week 3, probably at the latest. We just saw Jahmyr Gibbs finish as a top 4 back in the latter half of last season. Kyren Williams as well. Now, I know there's the whole punt return thing there. I don't even get me started on that. We're not talking about Kyren Williams. We're talking about Jonathan Taylor. We just saw Kyren Williams come off of a bonker season where he just finished as the running back 2 in fantasy points per game. I'm not going to say he kept pace with Christian McCaffrey, but the only 2 guys to average more than 20 fantasy points per game last year. He's going after Jonathan Taylor. Now, do both of those guys have their reasons for skepticism? Yes, they absolutely do. But theirs feel a lot more what if than Jonathan Taylor's, who's is entirely circumstantial. So to invest first round capital as the Jonathan Taylor at the running back 5, I almost said Saquon Barkley for this, who's going as the running back 4, but I honestly think there's more of an upside case to be made for Saquon Barkley than Jonathan Taylor, admittedly, because again, his bread and butter is similar to Derrick Henry. He's going to score a crap ton of touchdowns, but if he's sharing that with an alpha rushing quarterback, who could have a Cam Newton, a Jalen Hurts-esque kind of season, that's just not something I'm willing to sign up for in the first round.
No, and you boil in the fact too that he's just not going to be a huge threat in the receiving game. There is not a huge receiving role for him in this offense. You're banking on touchdowns again. And can it happen? Sure. But at the same time, how at the end of the season, I feel like we're going to be in the position of we're going to be asking more what if than saying, what a season it was from Jonathan Taylor. It'll still be a good season, but I feel like we're going to have that sour taste in our mouth of like, gosh darn it, if Anthony Richardson didn't scarf, X amount of touchdowns, that Jonathan Taylor, could be, would be more celebrated. So I don't think there's anything wrong with Jonathan Taylor, the player, because you could also make the argument too that like it's an investment in the Colts offense. Like I get it, but there are just some more question marks that you don't necessarily want to be asking for a guy going in the late first round, early second round.
Jonathan Taylor currently going ahead of Jahmyr Gibbs, Garrett Wilson, and Puka Nacua in fantasy drafts right now, according to Draft Shark's consensus ADP. I think those are three players I would much rather draft, even Puka Nacua with his injury, ahead of Jonathan Taylor right now. I just believe in all their roles more than I do Jonathan Taylor, and the concern I have around him sharing basically goal line duties with Anthony Richardson this year. Now, before we dive into your next league loser, Ty, I'm going to talk to the 90% again. And the 90%, if you're new here, the 90% is the amount of people who watch our videos and haven't subscribed. So we're going to change that right now. What I'm going to ask you to do is go down and hit that subscribe button, turn on those notifications as well. That way you'll know when all of our newest videos are up. We are posting 3 videos a week, all throughout the season, all throughout the rest of the off season, which is like, haha, only 1 week until week 1, which is crazy. But make sure to subscribe, turn on those notifications as well. If you want access to our podcast feed, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts from. Just search Fantasy Football Fellas there. All of our videos are posted in podcast format as well. But primary way to watch us, youtube.com/@thefantasyfootballfellas. If you're not subscribed, take a moment to do that now. Ty, who is your second player with league losing downside?
It's Brandon Ayuk, the guy that can't seem to figure out a contract with his own team right now. Reports as of Wednesday on that contract situation from Mike Garafolo of the NFL Network, still stuck in the mud. We are no closer to an extension or a trade than we were the last couple weeks. Now, the last couple weeks, there seem to have been some steps taken, but just the vibe from those quotes, it's not really that close. Not yet, at
Not
least.
great.
Not great. The 49ers are getting into their practice schedule this week and are practicing Wednesday. And he hasn't had a single snap or rep with the team this summer. It's kind of, I get Josh Jacobs vibes a little bit, right? Josh Jacobs held out for so long, and then he came back and it was just a disappointment because he just wasn't in the flow of the offense. All that stuff, that it has that kind of vibe to it for Ayuk this year. And we've talked about how even if things are resolved, right, contracts and all that, he is a likely regression candidate after his insanely efficient 2023, where he was second in yards per reception with 17.9, and he was second in EPA. You lower his yards per reception by 3 yards to 14.9, which is essentially 15 still, and he's outside the top 20 wide receivers on a per game basis. Plus, you may not think it matters, but Trent Williams also holding out for his contract extension, potentially not playing for the Niners, is huge news. Last year, when Trent Williams was out with an injury in weeks 7 to 9, the Niners had the 9th lowest points per game. And Brandon Ayuk himself was the wide receiver 26 in points per game. So with all the contract disputes and drama that comes with it, you still have to take him exactly where he finished last year as the wide receiver 17. And on certain platforms, you have to pay up for him at the end of the second round. It is far too risky for me. Yes, it's a good Niners offense. Gosh, there is so much that is kind of working against Brandon Ayuk for me that pushes me to say that he's got some league losing downside, not upside, downside.
If you're playing to lose your league this year, got a guy with you with a ton of upside here to lose you your league. Technically not an incorrect statement, depending on how you look at it. But
what
I mean, this
what
is
a wild, I was going to say, what a wild like league punishment. You win your league. Like you have to go to like IHOP for 24 hours. What a wild league that would be.
Like inverse it all. Next year, you have to like draft all players who have just like league losing downside. intentionally bomb your league. Nobody would want to
Intentionally.
win. Everyone's playing not to lose. Look, the thing with Ayuk is that I feel like we've been harping on this the entire offseason. This is a game we've all played before, and we didn't have to play it. We didn't have to. We didn't have to lose. You didn't have to worry about drafting Brandon Ayuk or be in on Brandon Ayuk because we knew this was going to happen. We knew there was going to be a regression to begin with. Now it's, again, Trent Williams holding out. Now you got Brandon Ayuk, who is due for regression, but like, let's not pretend that if he ends up in Washington or Pittsburgh, it's all sunshine and roses. Like, the first two rounds are not primarily about minimizing risk, but the less risk you can take on in the early rounds, the better off you're going to be. So, like you said, Ty, even with a Brandon Ayuk going in the early third round, it might not feel as bad. You're like, you know what, I do get some upside here, but also you might not, because if he gets traded to one of those two teams, you're banking on Jaden Daniels being all that and being able to support, basically Brandon Ayuk is a top 20 wide receiver based on his ADP. That's basically what you're banking on. Or Russell Wilson, who was just named the starter for the Steelers, while George Pickens is also there. I also don't believe that's going to be a possibility. So the best case scenario for Brandon Ayuk is that he stays in San Francisco. He's on the field, but again, with a contract dispute here, it's just not looking optimistic at all whatsoever based on all the reports that are coming out. I'll keep us moving here. I'll talk about my second player with league losing downside. I'm also going to talk about a wide receiver going technically in the third round, though I think he's going to be drafted in round 2 by most people, and it's Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. And I'm not 100% walking back my pro Chris Olave stance just yet, but I'm coming mighty close here as we inch closer to the season, because I actually do think there's some legit league losing downside here. My biggest hope for Olave was that with Clint Kubiak coming over, they were going to be running a lot more play action, pre-snap motion, to free him up some easier looks. However, golly, Ty, this stat broke my heart. Hayden Winks of the Underdog Football Show, he posted on Twitter that the Saints have a 0% RPO rate and the 5th lowest play action rate this preseason. I couldn't believe it. I thought Clint Kubiak was going to come over and change it up from what the Saints were doing. As of right now, it is not looking great for Chris Olave. If they're not going to add any easy buttons into this offense or add any sort of new creativity, especially without Ryan Ramczyk this year, like, it may already be Jover for Chris Olave, who has yet to finish better than the wide receiver 20 in fantasy points per game in his career. It is becoming scarier and scarier as we inch closer to the season. And where I once was able to easily hit the draft button on Chris Olave, I am cooling way off now. And I am afraid we're going to get, like another just Terry McLaurin-esque kind of season from Chris Olave where it's all bark and no bite.
Yeah, like, what you're getting with Chris Olave, right? You are getting the number one wideout on the Saints that last year, again, his best points per game finish at the wide receiver 20 was 80 receptions, 138 targets, a little over 1,100 yards, but just 5 touchdowns. That I don't want to call him like a safe play, because that kind of takes away from the losing side of the argument. But for where he's going in drafts, like, it's a disappointment. And you can get guys that will likely finish ahead of him that will give you more points, right? Because that's all that we're here to do. We're here to get guys to score the most points, right? So you can like Chris Olave, the player. We all love Chris Olave, the player. We think he's a pretty underrated wide receiver just because no one's really paying attention to New Orleans. But the fact is, this team probably isn't going to be scoring much, especially, there was some hope with the coordinator change. That doesn't seem to be happening now. So you just kind of have to ask yourself, like, what are the positives? And it just feels like we're counting up more negatives now when it comes to Chris Olave than positives.
I'm going to quick walk us back to Brandon Ayuk for a second. I just saw a tweet on Twitter from the Underdog NFL account. Per GM Lynch, Brandon Ayuk, he is expected to practice on Wednesday. Literally just broke as we were recording this. What's your update?
49 from Cam, what's his name? Cam Inman. If he's a 49ers reporter, 49ers practice is underway and no sign of Brandon Ayuk in warmups. Oh boy.
Oh boy. How long ago was that?
15 minutes ago. Half hour ago,
Oh
actually.
no. An Underdog report was 55 minutes ago.
Wide receivers participating. This came out literally like 30 seconds ago. Deebo Samuel, Ricky Pearsall in a no contact shirt, Chris Conley, Jacob Cowing, Trent Taylor, and Tay Martin, who are on the practice squad, not participating, Brandon Ayuk and Jawan Jennings.
There you got it. I mean, we're recording this Day, August 28th, 5:45 p.m. Central Time. That's all fresh news right there for you, ladies and gentlemen. That is it's not looking good for Brandon Ayuk. If Lynch comes out and says he's supposed to practice and now he's not out there. Not great, Bob. Not great.
Not great, Bob.
Okay, we'll come back to Chris Olave now. I to put a bow on Chris Olave, then we'll go into a quick break. Ty, you're 100% right. This offense is not going to be good this year. Alvin Kamara could catch all the checkdowns in the world and be great for fantasy football, but in terms of scoring touchdowns, in terms of Chris Olave taking that next step to be a true alpha in the league, again, it's the same problem as Terryy McLaurin. You can't get him a competent quarterback play. You can't get him in a flourishing offense, which it's so much easier than all of a sudden to just keep looking down the board at all these other wide receivers going after him, where Deebo Samuel, again, with everything about Brandon Ayuk, he is the far easier click than Chris Olave. Nico Collins, I know you and you're a little bit more in on Nico than I am, but like in a Texans offense that's looking to be explosive, that's gonna be a darn good offense, and Nico's a darn good wide receiver. Cooper Kupp with Matthew Stafford. Mike Evans is the one where I'm like, Chris Olave and Mike Evans might be more of a conversation. Jalen Waddle in the Miami Dolphins offense, right? Like, it's so much easier to just keep looking down the board and find guys who are much easier clicks than Olave, especially if the situation isn't going to change for as much better as we anticipated it. All right, Ty, we got two more players to chat about after the break, but let's pause, recollect ourselves after all that Brandon Ayuk news and discussion. We will be back shortly. Today's podcast episode is brought to you by Underdog Fantasy, where it is best ball summer. There are 5 core best ball tournaments to play in with over $20 million up for grabs this summer. You can even take a crack at winning the top prize of $1.5 million in their infamous Best Ball Mania 5 contest. To enter, head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the app and use the code FELLAS to get a first deposit bonus up to $250 and our 2024 draft guide for free. Again, head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the app and use code FELLAS to sign up. Must be 18 plus and present in a state where Underdog Fantasy operates. Terms apply. Concerned with your play? Call 1-800-522-4700 or visit npcgambling.org. Alrighty, we are back. We have talked about Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, Brandon Ayuk, and Chris Olave all having league-losing downside this year. Ty, we got 2 more players to talk about here, one for each of us. Who is the player you want to bring up?
Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts, the wide receiver 1 for the Colts. He was the wide receiver 16 in points per game last year in a very advantageous situation. It's a backup quarterback who only had one seasoned vet, if we want to call Michael Pittman Jr. that. So he got peppered with targets on the 86th ranked ADOT. He was not used downfield at all. He has actually never been utilized downfield at all. Now this year, he's still the seasoned vet, but it's going to be a much different offense with Anthony Richardson. You also have, I should say, a year 2 Josh Downs that maybe his ankle injury, maybe it lingers, but it's still enough there to cause some competition. And then you've got a rookie in AD Mitchell, who we are both very high on as a talent. Maybe doesn't hit the ground running right away, but if he comes around in the second half of the season, that's going to impact Michael Pittman Jr. And for all we know, AD Mitchell could just be the big play downfield threat in this offense, and he becomes the much more desirable asset to have. Your hope for Michael Pittman Jr. is that he's the RPO guy because those are the quickest way for him to rack up targets like he was last year. Is Anthony Richardson the general upgrade from Gardner Minshew? Yes, he is. 1000%. But is it an upgrade that can be beneficial to the wide receivers on the team? That is TBD to me. And that's what makes me believe that he can lose you your league because the upside isn't the same as it was last year. We are big fans of Anthony Richardson. We are big fans of Shane Steichen. There is just going to be repercussions in this offense because of a now more mobile quarterback that is going to try to get the ball out quicker out of his hand. So yes, we've talked about Jonathan Taylor, and now we are now talking about Michael Pittman Jr. They are great talents. But this is in fantasy football, and when you look at where they go in drafts, gosh, it is a hard sell on those guys with what's going on around them.
The one thing I will bring up with Michael Pittman is I think he's going to see an absurd amount of first read targets this year. It's very clear in the RPO. It's going to be hand off to JT. No, we're throwing it to Michael Pittman as the first read. I think that's 100% possible. And could Michael Pittman see, another 150 plus targets this year? I think it's within the realm of possibility. That's also what you're contingent on. I mean, looking at Michael Pittman thus far in his career, 15.6 fantasy points per game last year was good for the wide receiver 14. He needed 156 targets to get there. In 2022, 141 targets, 13 and a half fantasy points per game, wide receiver 21. 2021, 129 targets, 14 fantasy points per game. The wide receiver 22. The guy is going to need 150 targets to get there because he's not going to score the touchdowns. Touchdowns have never been his thing. And when you get around the red zone where it's like, okay, if Michael Pittman can add that to his game this year, I just don't think that's going to be a reality. I think this team is going to be running the ball like crazy inside of the 10-yard line, inside of the 5-yard line, inside of the red zone. When you have Anthony Richardson, when you have Jonathan Taylor, when you brought up A.D. Mitchell, I think he's probably the better red zone threat. He has a better red zone skill set than Michael Pittman. So if it's not going to come by 150 targets this year, which again, I'm not ruling out, but when you have to spend a third-round pick on Michael Pittman, where once again, let's just name some of the guys going around him. Cooper Kupp is going 6 picks ahead of him, far easier of a click. Jalen Waddle going afterwards, far easier of a click. DK Metcalf, I think he has more upside than Michael Pittman this year, far easier of a click. DJ Moore, with what we've been seeing from Caleb Williams, I think he's become the easier click for me at that point too. You could even wait on Malik Neighbors for a whole round, basically. And now I know that's a worse offense, but at what point do you just say Malik Neighbors is the better wide receiver than Michael Pittman? Let's bet on talent here. So again, you look at the range in which Michael Pittman's going in and the capital you have to spend on him. He actually might be giving you more 5th, 6th round value than 3rd round value based on, again, what we know is going to be a lack of touchdowns, and what you're dependent on is basically getting 150 targets. Otherwise, we're looking at him potentially being outside of the top 20 wide receivers this year with even more downside than that. We'll keep it moving here, Ty. I'll wrap us out with our final player. I want to talk about the guy who's going in the 5th round, the guy I brought up at the top of the podcast feed. Aaron Jones. My last player with league losing downside. Now, I know Cameron loves Aaron Jones, but he's not here today. He doesn't get to defend Aaron Jones. So I get to tear down Aaron Jones and tell you why I think he's actually a rather terrible early 5th round pick. Football-wise, almost everything here is a downgrade for Aaron Jones. I don't know what we're quite excited for here. The offensive line's a downgrade, the defense, the quarterback play, all those things, downgrades for Aaron Jones. That's not particularly something I'm looking forward to for a running back who's coming off one of the worst efficiency seasons in his career. Sub 20% juke rate last year, the lowest breakaway run rate since 2019. He was 42nd in fantasy points per opportunity last year. And this is a guy, too, who has only played one fully healthy season in his career, and this team still wants to keep Ty Chandler involved. So while there's the slightest amount of PPR intrigue here because you've got TJ Hawkinson is going to miss the start of the season, I just really don't understand what the optimism here is for a mini bounce back season for Jones after he finished as the running back 26 in fantasy points per game last year. We're now drafting him as the running back 18 in the early 5th round. the sky isn't up. I think it's only down, and that's just not something I'm willing to invest in the early 5th round, where, once again, let's just look at some of the guys going around him, Ty, in the early 5th round. You've got Dalton Kincaid, elite tight end in this range. You've got Amari Cooper, James Conner, who I just prefer straight up, Anthony Richardson, George Pickens, and T. Higgins. You and I both really like T. Higgins. David Montgomery, I think, is a far safer bet than Aaron Jones this year. There's just so many other players in this range where it's like easier of a click, especially when you know that Aaron Jones could only give you 12 games this year and you're basically missing 5 games of production from him.
The biggest thing for me is while he was in Green Bay, you knew that Matt LaFleur needed the run game to be a big part of his offense. Kevin O'Connell showed last year with all the backup quarterbacks, he doesn't need the run game. Like it may not result in, W's in the records and stuff like that, but the offense functioned without a run game. So that's not to say that like Aaron Jones can't be, the 1A this year. I think we would expect him to be. The issue is there is way too much of a chance of KOC just going, no, like Jefferson's going to get like 12 targets a game and Jordan Addison's going to chip in 7. Like you said, like your only hope is that he can capitalize on this early part of the season where there is no TJ Hawkinson, right? So he can capitalize on some receiving opportunities and stuff like that. Like, I don't really know exactly, like, you mentioned some of the names that are going in the range where he goes. It's just because people see Aaron Jones, see these other running backs as like running back ones on their team. So they're like, oh, I got to take them before some of the other backups. And it's like, honestly, I know that some of these guys have a straightforward path to touches and stuff like that, but you may be best off to just wait for the running back 2s that may not be on the field as much as an Aaron Jones per se. They're just going to be in overall better situations than where Aaron Jones is this year. So this is one of those, like, that you like the talent of Aaron Jones. It is a good NFL pickup, right? But it is not exactly a good like fantasy pickup.
The Vikings last year the Vikings last year, the 3rd lowest run play percentage. They also had the 9th fewest targets to the running back position last year. So those are just things for Aaron Jones that, again, just do not excite me. Aaron Jones only 2 rushing touchdowns each of the last 2 seasons. I don't think this Vikings offense is going to be running the ball around the goal line very often in Kevin O'Connell's offense. I just don't see the world where it gets any better than the running back 18 for Aaron Jones. And again, I'm not going to be surprised when he misses 5 games this year and all of a sudden, your 5th round pick, you're not getting quality running back 2 production from, in even 50% of the games he does play this year. So Aaron Jones to me is another player with league losing downside, which does bring us to the end of the episode, Ty. Thanks for tuning in, y'all. We will be back next week. One final mock draft for you crazy people who draft 1 or 2 days before the season. We're going to go ahead on Wednesday then and predict the fantasy MVPs. And then can you believe it, Ty? We're already into starts and sits in every week 1 matchup a week from today.
It's here.
That is
it's
insane.
Here, baby.
That's insane. Football season is here, people. So again, remember, make sure you subscribe and turn on those notifications because we are bringing you content all season long. We have so many great videos planned for you all. We've got panic patients, we've got rankings, we've got trade targets, we've got starts and sits literally every single week for you all. So again, to the 90%, make sure you're subscribed. Please turn on those notifications. We would appreciate that. And to the 10% of you who do watch our videos through, who do support us constantly, we appreciate you as well. Till next time, stay safe, stay healthy. Deuces.